On the evening of October 30th, 1503, something occurred inside the Vatican's Apostolic Palace that rocked the world is fundamentally Christian, under vaulted ceilings constructed in reverence for the divine. The chilly marble floor was covered in 50 nude courtesans. Bishops and cardinals remained still, their quiet weighing more than the atmosphere. Pope Alexander VII sat in the middle of it all, watching, grinning, and even laughing. He oversaw the event as though it were his own perverse celebration. However, the witnesses only witnessed the first scenario that evening. The real nightmare was still to come. Centuries later, even the most seasoned chroniclers found it difficult to record what transpired, since it was so heinous and diametrically antithetical to the concept of sanctity. This is the tale of Lucrezia Borgia, a lady imprisoned in a dynasty that valued power over human decency, blood, or religion. One of the worst stains in Vatican history was caused by this woman's wedding night. Subscribe to Grim History and click the like button if you find buried atrocities of the past fascinating. Tell me where you're watching from when you get to the part that most disturbs you. Now let's get started. The bells of St. Peter sounded across Rome in the autumn of 1503, bringing with them news that swiftly spread throughout Italy. The Pope had declared that his daughter, who had been widowed twice under dubious circumstances, would get married again. However, there would be no calm grand hall or far-off palace this time. The event would be held in the papal palaces of the Vatican itself, beneath a hallowed painting and symbols that symbolized the judgment of heaven. Alfonso d'Este, the teenage heir to the influential Duchy of Ferrara, was the groom selected for Lucrezia. This union appeared to be a political victory to the rest of Italy. Alfonso thought it was more akin to a silent execution. Lucrezia's past was notorious. Giovanni Sforza, her first husband, fled Rome, citing that assassins had been dispatched to kill him. According to a rumor that pointed directly at her brother, Cesare Borgia, her second, Alfonso of Aragon, had been strangled on the steps of the Vatican. And now the Borgia family was binding another Alfonso. He knew the threat. In Italy, all nobles did. Alfonso did everything he could to escape from what he knew was coming: delays, diplomatic justifications, and approval via ambassadors. But Alexander V did not put up with rejection. He had complete authority inside the Vatican, surrounded by cardinals with red robes. The simple word, "Accept this marriage or be destroyed," was carried by messengers who rode towards Ferrara day and night. Ferrara would have to deal with Caesar's ruthless soldiers if the Este family resisted. Excommunication would deprive them of supporters and legitimacy, and their dynasty might be destroyed. Italy well knew the reality. Nobody made it through a battle with the Borgia. Duke Eldeste instructed his son to go to Rome and submit to the inevitable alliance after realizing that resistance would result in devastation. In the meantime, Lucrezia Borgia, who was just 21 years old, was staring out over the eternal city from her Vatican apartments with a sorrowful expression. She was portrayed in Europe as a seductress, a poisoner, and a chess piece manipulator of men. But those closest to her knew the reality. She was a pawn caught between a father and a brother with unbridled ambitions, not a mastermind of lies. When her first marriage didn't work out for them, it was dissolved. She had truly loved her second husband, who was killed before her eyes. She was powerless to stop or extend revenge. Her attendants murmured that she woke up in the middle of the night, trembling from dreams she wouldn't talk about and clutching her chest. Even though she was certain that this third marriage would not result in love, she had no idea what her wedding night would entail. Behind the walls of the Vatican, something sinister, cunning, and brutal was assembling. Although the preparations for the ceremony went swiftly, the atmosphere within the papal palace felt oppressive. Employees looked away. Cardinals whispered softly. At strange hours, strange people moved through prohibited hallways. There were rumors circulating about guests being carried in through secret passageways and secret instructions. And more than anybody else, one man felt the burden of it all. The master of ceremonies in the Vatican is Johann Burchard. Under Alexander VI, he had seen innumerable scandals: lavish feasts, political bribery, and the sale of holy positions like trinkets. But there was something about this evening that made him feel coldly uneasy. He had a feeling that this event would surpass all the scandals he had ever documented. He had a feeling that he was going to see something that history would find difficult to describe. A golden, polished, and unavoidable trap had been set, and the bride and groom had already begun to march in the direction of its center. Alonso d'Este arrived in Rome in December with a small entourage. He had traveled from Ferrara through icy mountains, terrible roads, and a mounting sense of dread that weighed heavily on his chest. But he was unprepared for the sight of the Vatican. A massive stone building that rises above the city, partially obscured by scaffolding and partially illuminated by candles. It appeared more like a fortress designed to engulf anyone who dared to resist it than the core of Christianity. The welcome was magical. Inside, Alexander V sat on its throne, his gleaming gold and white robes reflecting the candlelight like molten metal. Caesar was standing next to him, unmovable, silent, and terrifyingly restrained. He was already feared throughout Italy at the age of 26. At his direction, entire families disappeared. Cities gave up as he approached. The implication became clear as he fixed his gaze at Alfonso. Here, you are not a guest. Alfonso suffered humiliation under the pretense of joy. At banquets, he was seated next to courtesans as senior religious members looked on with barely disguised enjoyment. Caesar had a brutal skill on hunts that seemed more like a warning than a sport. At various festivities, Alexander made scathing comments about Lucrezia's previous husband's tortuous fates in front of the entire court. In each motion was the same subtle threat. Now you are ours. And the worst part of this wedding, the true tragedy that would be remembered for centuries, had not yet started. During certain hunts, Alonso was reminded by Caesar's icy, perfect precision that he controlled not only armies, but also terror itself. With each arrow and felled beast, at various festivities, Alexander made fun of Lucrezia's previous husband's fortunes in front of the entire court, implying almost cheerfully that a Borgia son-in-law's life was always short. Alfonso attempted to maintain what little dignity he still had, but by then, he was a prisoner covered in ceremonies. Under tenuous pretenses, his personal nights were kept separate in the Vatican. He slept in apartments that papal guards monitored day and night. The reality became increasingly clear with each hour that passed by. There was no way out of the trap he had entered. The marriage was just a front. The real motive was much more heinous. The aim of the Borgias was to shame the Este family in front of Italy, shatter their pride, and demonstrate to all the noble houses from Florence to Naples that any lineage, regardless of age or strength, could be destroyed by their will. While Alfonso was undergoing this silent psychological siege, plans of a completely different kind were taking place deep within the Vatican. Caesar personally oversaw the feast on the wedding night, and his vision went far beyond what even the most decadent circles in Rome would have ventured to say out loud. He met with his father in private to finalize the arrangements, information that would have appalled anyone who still revered the church.
50 of Rome's most striking courtesans were handpicked and transported into hidden rooms under the palace. These were sophisticated, well-educated ladies who visited the salons of aristocrats rather than common prostitutes. When they found out what the Pope demanded of them, many shuddered, but none dared to oppose the head of Christianity. They were told to wear opulent silk and velvet clothing that they would eventually have to take off. In order for them to be unexpectedly led into the papal quarters on the night of the wedding, they were conducted through secret passageways illuminated by lanterns. When they saw these preparations, the servants repeatedly crossed themselves and whispered prayers that stuck to their lips like frost. They were aware that something sinister had started to emerge inside the Vatican's gates. Lucrezia felt it too. Despite being purposefully left out of the most of the preparations, she could sense the ominous tension building. Her maids claimed seeing her brother Caesar walking around with a smile that made their blood run cold. Unexpected people sliding down hallways and courtesans showing up in areas they didn't belong in. Lucrezia fled to the Sinane Chapel the night before the wedding because she could not stand the oppressive atmosphere. She fell to her knees beneath Michelangelo's enormous, thunderous sky, beneath the painted hand of God stretching towards Adam. She hoped for anything, rescue, an intervention, a sign, anything, rather than love or happiness. But there was no sound in the chapel. The sublime seemed unattainable. The candles seemed to be struggling to survive as they flickered in the chilly air and crept through old crevices. Outside, the Vatican was getting ready for a festival that would make it difficult to distinguish between horrific depravity and sacred ceremony. The master of ceremonies, Jan Burchard, went over the last procedure in his chamber. As he dipped his quill, his hand quivered. He was all too aware that what he was going to document would either be lost forever or become the most damning record in church history. A sight that would bring even the gates of the Vatican closer to hell was on the horizon as the night of October 30th, 1503 drew near. The magnificence of a papal wedding greeted the dawn of October 30th. Over Rome's 7 hills, the sound of St. Peter's bells reverberated. People flocked to the streets around the Vatican hoping to catch a glimpse of the notorious bride. A dozen servants prepared Lucrezia inside the papal residence. Beneath the candles, her robe was made of shimmering silk embroidered with gold that glowed like liquid flame. Her beautiful, vivid hair flowed in elaborate plaits down her shoulders and was expertly braided with pearls. Her face looked pallid, powered to cover off the anxiety and tiredness under her eyes. She didn't see a bride when she glanced in the mirror. She perceived a sacrifice. The papal chapel, a room covered in golden walls and sacred artwork, served as the venue for the event. As Alexander V the Sixth personally performed the ceremony, his loud voice filling the hallowed chamber, rows of scarlet-clad cardinals stood rigidly along the chapel, their faces meticulously sculpted into masks of devotion. But something else, dread, flickered under their polished piety. They all knew the reputation of Borgia. They all felt that what they had seen today was merely the beginning. The guests were brought to the Borgia residences after the wedding. Pinturicchio's fresco-painted halls, the tales of saints, heroes, and stories that had lined the walls were now tarnished by the impending revelry. Roasted boar was piled high on enormous tables. Pheasants, with their feathers still on, goblets of wine from Italy's best vineyards, and mountains of unusual fruit. The room was packed with cardinals, Roman aristocrats, Ferrara emissaries, and carefully chosen courtiers. Sitting at the head table, Alfonso and Lucrezia were ensnared in a celebration that already seemed surreal, like a mask hiding something more sinister. The supper began like any noble feast would. The air was filled with the soft sound of treasure and vials. Hollow compliments were given, toasts were made, and courteous diplomacy was carried out. However, the atmosphere changed as the night grew darker. Alexander became louder and happier, already flushed from excessive drinking. Caesar, who had been silent up until that point, slowly stood up and gave a subtle order by tilting his head. The enormous doors crashed shut. The guards took their places. Nobody would go out of this room. The last line separating decadence and depravity was destroyed by what transpired next. At the signal of Caesar, the side doors opened, and 50 courtesans draped in velvet and jewels but unable to conceal the fear in their eyes entered the hall. A dense, smoke-like silence filled the room. Then, grinning as if revealing a work of art, Alexander stood from his seat and declared that the real show was about to start. At Alexander's orders, the courtesans started removing all layers of velvet and silk, allowing their glittering clothing to fall to the marble floor until they were entirely naked in front of the assemblage. A scene that seemed ripped from a profane dream was glanced at by a cathedral that had been built for devotion. Cardinals turned their heads away, frantically drawing crosses over their chests with quivering fingers. The guards at the entrance moved forward with their hands resting on their swords, while some attempted to get up and flee, making it very clear that nobody would be able to avoid this sight. Alfonso's expression was a mask of disgust and amazement, and all he could do was stare. Terrified, Lucrezia sat next to him, her hands clutched so firmly in her lap that her knuckles turned white as her tears silently seeped into the silk of her bridal gown. The Pope's next directive followed. They ordered the nude courtesans to go between the long dinner tables. Towering candelabra were ignited by servants, and the flames created jagged shadows on the walls covered with frescoes. The woman's outlines twisted across the sacred paintings as they traveled through the flickering light like phantom entities. Angels and saints calmly saw the Vatican's transformation into a pagan rite. But Alexander was just getting started. He ordered that baskets of chestnuts be brought in and spread all over the beautiful marble floor, in an act intended only to degrade. The sound of the nuts rolling between the startled guests' feet reverberated like lightning. The Pope then declared the next stage of his wickedness. In order for the chestnuts to be gathered, the courtesans had to crawl on all fours between the legs of aristocrats and cardinals, like animals forced into a hideous competition.
Silk cloaks, gold jewelry, and valuables from the papal vault would be awarded to the woman who collected the most. Jan Burchard, toughened by years of witnessing the Vatican's darkest moments, subsequently stated that he found it difficult to put into words the extent of the humiliation that ensued. While Alexander and Chesser watched from an elevated platform, laughing, pointing, and putting bets as if this were a cheap entertainment in a brothel rather than the beating heart of Christendom. 50 nude ladies crept across the sacred Vatican floor between the robes of church lords. A few inebriated young cardinals, overcome by the chaos of the evening, chuckled and applauded. Crushed by the conflict between their fear of the Pope and their faith, others bowed their heads. Alfonso sat still, unable to believe that this nightmare was a part of his wedding feast in front of the man claiming to speak for God in the Vatican. And poor Lucrezia, her wedding gown had turned into a shroud. Her tears had turned into a frozen, empty expression. She had always knew her father and brother were capable of horrible things, but she never thought they would make her wedding a damnation rite. However, the night had not yet reached its lowest point. Alexander V eventually announced the conclusion of the chestnut feast as midnight drew near, and the Vatican clocks struck 12. Weary, the nude courtesans gathered in corners with their degrading rewards. The tables were soaked in wine. Half inebriated, half startled, and completely shattered, the guests sat still. But Alexander was clear-headed, concentrated, and determined, and his next order made the hall so silent that the crackling of the candles could be heard. He declared that the sacred obligation of marriage now needed to be carried out in an authoritative voice. But whatever dignity was left in the room was destroyed by what he ordered next. He declared that Alonso d'Este needed to demonstrate his marriage to Lucrezia 3 times, and not just once. To confirm that the union was irreversibly sealed in front of the church and the world, all witnesses were required to stay in their positions. A terrified silence fell over the hall. Even Chesser, whose name was linked with ferocity, gave his father a stern look after being taken aback by the decree's sheer audacity. Alonso slowly stood up, the color gone from his cheeks. He was brought up as a prince with a strong sense of duty and honor. But now that Chesser's armed men were all around him, their hands clutching their sword hilts, he realized there was no way to resist this order. He looked over to Lucrezia. She shuddered like a bird caught in the shadow of a predator. Her spirit had already been bruised beyond recognition, and her eyes were empty. She moved her lips, but no sound came out. Alfonso was left with no option under the Pope's eager gaze and the guard's deadly stares. He led Lucrezia to a nearby room that was once intended to greet diplomats, but was now outfitted as a bridal chamber. The doors were still ajar. No humanity, no privacy. Those who had not run away were made to stand in the outer room where they could see what was going to happen. What came next was not a union. It was the annihilation of 2 people. In startled stillness, witnesses gazed. Desperate prayers were whispered by a few. Others sobbed in silence. Even the courtesans, who had been degraded themselves, turned away in sorrow. A single unsaid fact pervaded the Vatican as the night wore on and the Pope's terrible decree gradually came to pass. Rome would never be the same when something sacred perished in that palace.
Lucrezia had descended into a state beyond tiredness and anxiety by the time the night stretched into its last hours. Her mind had split off from the nightmare that was taking on all around her in an attempt to live. She moved mindlessly and robotically, as if her essence had deserted her body to get away from the terror she was no longer able to resist. Pope Alexander V VI then ordered the third and last execution of his hideous sentence. Just as the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the windows of the Borgia apartments. Cesar was back, observing with the same clinical detachment he employed on the battlefield, keeping a cool eye on every aspect. After the ordeal was over, he proudly declared that the marriage was now bound 3 times, sealed in the eyes of the law and the church, and unchangeable. Alexander V VI grinned as if the evening had been a lavish celebration rather than a plunge into a moral abyss, raising his wine cup with delight. The survivors, a group of shattered souls, were all that was left in the room. Cardinals who had entered the flat as God's servants wearing scarlet now stood as unwilling spectators to a crime they were unable to acknowledge. They had become accomplices due to their inaction and silence. Devastation was apparent when the sun completely rose over Rome.
There were empty wine jugs, chestnuts smashed into the marble floor, weary courtesans curled up in corners, and sculptures of guards with their gaze downcast. Lucrezia lay still in the adjacent room, gazing up as though the ceiling itself were far away. Her spirit was somewhere unreachable, but her body was still in the room. With his face buried in his hands, Alfonso sat at the edge of the bed, shivering furiously. This night had devastated him more than any battlefield, political threat, or event in his life. There was no kind of retaliation strong enough to give him back what had been taken from him. Broken beyond repair, he discreetly left Rome in a matter of days and returned to Ferrara with a lifelong silence. He never mentioned the night again. It was impossible to contain the story. The banquet's news spread like wildfire. Whispers in the streets of Rome developed into murmurs throughout Italy, which eventually exploded into reports that were transmitted to European tribunals. The letters that ambassadors wrote were encrypted. Priests used veiled cautions in their speech. The communications were read by nobles in astonished disbelief. What happened in the Vatican surpasses even the darkest imaginations of ancient Rome, the Venetian ambassador famously wrote. He claimed that the Pope had defiled the church as a whole in addition to his daughter. Once feared, the Borgias were now seen as the epitome of corruption. People would whisper their names in taverns and marketplaces, lowering their voices as if the family might hear them. Preachers throughout Europe used the story as evidence of Rome's moral decay. Martin Luther, a monk who would eventually cause chaos in the church, was one of them. He would come to view the Borgia feast as a metaphor for all that was poisoned in the Vatican years later. Jan Burchard, the one person who had seen everything from start to finish, documented everything in his diary. Knowing that his story may either disappear due to Vatican secrecy or become the most devastating testimonial ever published about the church, his hands trembled as he wrote. The shadow of that night never left Lucrezia Borgia. She and Alfonso relocated to Ferrara, where she made a valiant effort to lead a typical life as a duchess. She provided charitable funding. She defended artists. She fostered beauty and literature. But others who saw her in private reported the same thing. Eyes that had seen too much, a lingering sorrow, and a quiet melancholy. She had children with Alfonso, but their marriage was a hollow shell because of that night's irreversible poisoning. Despite living side by side, they are divided by a wound that no human could heal. After giving birth to her 8th child, Lucrezia Borgia passed away at the age of 39. She requested a priest on her deathbed and prayed until she passed away. "I am finally ready to be free," was her final recorded statement. Freedom, which she had been denied her whole life. Only a few months after the banquet, rumors whispered the poison, the instrument he had used so often,
finally returned to him. Alexander VI passed away. After his father passed away, Cesare Borgia lost his position of authority and was killed in a lonesome ambush in Spain. Far from the grandeur he thought he was destined for, his body was disfigured and dumped into an unmarked grave. But they did not perish on the night of October 30th, 1503. It became a representation of such extreme corruption that it stoked the Protestant Reformation. The Borgias were often cited by Martin Luther and others as evidence of the Vatican's decline. A portion of the subsequent Counter-Reformation was an attempt to remove this family's taint from history. But the reality endured. Burchard's diaries reappeared centuries later, bringing the incident back into the spotlight. The Chestnut Banquet and the Triple Shame remain notoriety reminders of what happens when total power loses all restraint. Even now, over 500 years after that night, it alerts us to the fact that places that are supposed to be sacred are often the sites of humanity's worst crimes. Lucrezia Borgia's wedding night story is more than just history. It serves as a warning, a mirror, and a reminder that evil often flourishes in silence. Please let us know in the comments if you've reached the end of this account so we know you supported us during this terrifying decline. And never remember that the past is still alive. It watches, it warns, it corrects.